The train's whistle tore across the Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, long and desperate, echoing through the hills before dissolving into the wide September sky. And when the iron beast hissed to a halt at the dusty station, its black smoke drifted over a crowd of rough men waiting on the platform, boots planted in dirt, eyes sharp with hunger that had little to do with food, for everyone knew this train carried mail-order brides from the east, women who had traded familiar streets for the unknown promise of the frontier. Among them stepped a young woman in a plain blue dress, worn at the hems from the journey, clutching a carpet bag that carried more hope than belongings. And though she tried to stand tall, her hands trembled as she scanned the men for a face she had studied only in ink and imagination. The man who had written her letters filled with sunsets and promises of steadiness. A man named Thomas Hale. Her name was Clara Whitfield, 22, Boston-born, her mother's voice still ringing in her memory. Hold your chin high, even if the ground shakes beneath your feet. And so she did. Even when she saw him step forward from the crowd, taller than she expected, shoulders broad from years of work under the sun, his hat pulled low over eyes that held a flicker of warmth before narrowing as if to measure her worth in a single glance. And though he tipped his hat with a show of courtesy, his words cut sharper than he knew. You're smaller than I expected. Clara's throat tightened, but she steadied herself and answered with quiet steel. The letters never asked about size, and a few men chuckled at her boldness, though Thomas ignored them, jerking his head toward the wagon at the edge of the platform, saying only, "Come on, road's long, chores waiting." And so, with no more welcome than that, Clara climbed into the creaking wagon and held her carpet bag as if it anchored her, glancing once over her shoulder at the train, its smoke veiling the tracks that ran east, the last thin cord to the life she had left behind, to streets that smelled of coal and bread, to a world that might have pitied her but at least had known her name. The road from the station stretched endless across prairie browned by late summer, sagebrush bowing in the wind, and Thomas said little, his jaw set, his hands sure on the reins. Clara stole glances at him, noting the gray streak in his dark hair, the lines carved deep at his eyes, wondering what kind of man he truly was, for his letters had been plain but steady, filled with talk of land, of his boy Jacob, of needing a woman's hand to bring warmth to a lonely home. And she had built in her mind a man of quiet dignity, maybe even kindness, but the man beside her seemed harder, as though the land itself had filed him down to stone. Hours later, when the wagon rattled into a valley shadowed by low hills, Clara saw the Hale homestead, a cabin of rough-cut logs, its roof patched with tin, a barn leaning like an old drunk, chickens scattering at the wagon's approach. On the porch stood a boy no older than 12, sharp-eyed, freckled, his face sunburned, and before Thomas could speak, the boy called, "This her?" Studying Clara with the frankness of one raised without the softness of manners, and Thomas muttered, "Mind your manners, Jacob, this is Clara." But the boy only smirked and said, "She looks scared," to which Clara, gathering her courage, forced a smile and answered, "And you look brave. That makes us even," leaving Jacob frowning as if unsure whether she had mocked him or not, and Thomas, without comment, lifted her carpet bag and carried it inside the cabin. The air within smelled of smoke and leather, of sweat soaked deep into wood. The single room downstairs was plain, rough-hewn table, shelves lined with jars of beans and flour, a narrow bed tucked in the corner, a trunk against the wall, and the weary sense of men surviving without comfort. Thomas gestured toward the trunk and said, "You can put your things there. Supper's beans. Breakfast'll be beans too, unless you cook different." And Clara, throat tight, managed only a nod, for this was it. This was the life she had chosen, sight unseen, and she must find a way to belong here or be swallowed whole by the silence. That first night, Clara lay awake on a straw mattress by the fire, the boy Jacob curled not far away, while across the room Thomas shifted restlessly on the bed. The cabin creaked beneath the wind, coyotes yipped far off, and Clara stared into the dark with thoughts circling back to those letters that had pulled her across a continent. Letters of sunsets turning the plains gold, of a boy's laughter ringing across pasture, of a man lonely but yearning for companionship. And she realized now how little ink could truly hold, how much had been left unsaid, like the sharpness in his tone, the cool distance in his gaze. Still she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling, "Lord, let there be more here than this. Let me not be just another item bought and left to rot." And in that whisper was both a plea and a vow. When dawn split the horizon in pink and gray, Clara rose before the men, her body weary but her will iron. She swept the cabin, boiled water from the well, patched a shirt she found draped over a chair, and laid out beans with a loaf of bread she had baked from flour and yeast she'd found in a jar, shaping it carefully, though her hands were clumsy with frontier tools. When Jacob stumbled out rubbing his eyes, the table was already set, and his surprise showed in how he fell upon the bread like a starving pup, chewing with delight, while Thomas ate without comment, though she saw the way his shoulders eased, if only slightly. For a flicker of a moment, pride bloomed in Clara's chest, a sense that she might make something of this place after all, that perhaps she could weave herself into the fabric of this rough family. But that night, as she washed dishes in cold water, hands red from the chill, Thomas leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes unreadable, and said low, "You'll find this place harder than you think." And Clara, without lifting her gaze, answered steady, "I'm not afraid of hard." And for a long moment silence stretched, only the drip of water from a plate breaking it, until Thomas muttered, "We'll see," and turned into the black Wyoming night, leaving the door swinging in his wake and Clara standing alone with the echo of her heartbeat and the burning knowledge that if she wanted to stay, if she wanted to carve a place for herself here, it would not be given. It would have to be fought for, earned with grit and fire enough to outlast every doubt, every whisper, every wall this land and this man could raise against her. The next morning began not with sunlight, but with the shrill sound of a rooster. That seemed determined to remind Clara how far she was from Boston's cobbled streets, and though her bones ached from the straw mattress and her hands were still red from yesterday's scrubbing, she rose quickly, determined to earn her place in this home that felt more like a test than a welcome. She boiled water, set beans to cook, and tried her best to bring order to the clutter of the small cabin. But soon Jacob came clattering down from the loft, half-dressed and quick with words, asking if she even knew how to milk a cow. And before Clara could answer, Thomas stepped in from the yard with his hat low and boots muddy, tossing her a pair of worn gloves, saying flatly, "You'll learn quick," which was less an instruction and more a warning. So she followed them out into the crisp Wyoming morning where the sun gilded the hills and the air smelled of dust and sage, and there in the pen stood the Hale family's 2 milk cows, bigger and less forgiving than she expected. Jacob smirked as she stumbled at first, the animal shifting beneath her hands, but Clara gritted her teeth, remembered her prayer from the night before, and refused to quit until milk foamed into the pail. And when she finally managed it, Thomas gave her the briefest nod, a gesture so small it might have been overlooked, yet it planted a fragile seed of pride in her chest. That afternoon she hung laundry in the yard, her fingers raw from scrubbing clothes against a washboard, while Jacob loitered nearby, testing her with questions about Boston, about fine dresses and city parties, sneering that she must be sorely disappointed to end up here. And Clara, instead of snapping, told him gently that disappointment had no place where survival was concerned, and she asked him whether he liked the land, whether he liked the wide sky that stretched forever, and to her surprise Jacob grew quiet, looking out across the hills before muttering, sometimes as if admitting it cost him dearly. But before the moment could grow, Thomas called from the barn, his voice carrying like thunder, and Jacob sprinted off, leaving Clara with the flapping clothes and the growing certainty that this land tested everyone, not just her. When evening came, Thomas hitched the wagon, saying little except "Yo town," and though Clara was unsure if she was welcome to join, she climbed in beside him, feeling the eyes of Jacob on her back as if he too wondered what she was doing there. The road into town rattled beneath the wheels, the sky burning orange as the sun bled into the horizon, and Clara caught herself staring at the man beside her, his profile carved like stone, the gray streak in his hair catching the last light. And she wondered who he had been before the land and life had chiseled him into silence. When they reached town, the boardwalk bustled with cowhands, shopkeepers and women in bonnets, and Clara felt their stares at once, whispers curling behind gloved hands, for everyone seemed to know she was a mail-order bride, bought and sent, a stranger grafted into their world. And though her cheeks burned, she lifted her chin just as her mother had taught her, walking beside Thomas into the general store where the smell of leather and flour mingled with sawdust. The shopkeeper's wife, a stout woman with sharp eyes, looked Clara up and down before asking, "So this is the girl you sent for, Thomas?" with a tone that made it sound like she was weighing a sack of grain, and Thomas only answered, "This is Clara, nothing more, nothing less." And while the woman sniffed and turned back to her shelves, Clara forced a polite smile, choosing silence over shame. But as they left the store, she caught a fragment of whispered gossip. Boston girl, they say, but no children. That's why her daddy sold her off, and her stomach knotted. For though she had fled Boston's pity, she had not escaped its shadow, and she climbed back into the wagon with a dignity that was more armor than ease, staring straight ahead as Thomas loaded the goods, his face unreadable, though she thought she caught a flicker of awareness in the set of his jaw. On the ride back, silence stretched like a rope pulled taut, broken only by the clatter of wheels and the low call of coyotes across the darkening hills. Until at last Thomas spoke, his voice rough. "You hear things in town? You let 'em roll off. Folks always got more words than sense," and Clara, her pride wounded yet burning with defiance, answered softly, "Words only matter if you let them, and I don't intend to." And she felt rather than saw his glance at her, the way he seemed to weigh her answer. And though he said nothing more, something in the air between them shifted, like the first crack in ice before spring melt. Back at the homestead, Clara tucked Jacob into his corner bed, humming a hymn her mother used to sing. And though the boy scoffed at first, his eyelids grew heavy, and he drifted off with less fight than usual. When she turned, she found Thomas watching from the doorway, his arms folded, expression unreadable. And for a heartbeat, she thought he might thank her. But instead he only said, "Don't get him soft. This land doesn't forgive softness," before stepping out into the night again, leaving Clara staring at the fire, torn between hurt and the stubborn resolve that had carried her this far. She whispered once more into the silence, not a prayer this time, but a promise to herself. "I will not be sent away, not by him, not by this land, not by anyone." The days that followed tested her vow. Mornings of blistered hands from milking and chopping, afternoons of aching back from bending over laundry and weeding a garden so starved for water it seemed more stubborn than fertile. Evenings of enduring Jacob's sharp tongue and Thomas's cold silence. But with each sunrise, Clara found herself learning, hardening, carving a place where none had been given. She learned which logs smoked least in the fire, how to mend a boot with sinew, how to quiet a restless cow with a steady hum. And though Thomas rarely spoke more than a handful of words, she noticed the way he began to leave chores undone, as if to test whether she would see to them. And when she did, he gave no thanks, only a brief glance that somehow carried weight enough to keep her going. Yet whispers from town reached the homestead faster than prairie fire, neighbors stopping by with excuses of borrowed tools or passing visits, their eyes sliding to Clara, their voices dripping with curiosity and doubt, asking if she knew how hard the winters could be, asking if she was strong enough, asking if Thomas had told her about the wife he'd buried 2 winters past. And Clara, though shaken by each revelation, never let them see her flinch, answering with steady words and a lifted chin, even as her heart churned with questions Thomas never spoke of. At night she lay awake again, listening to the wind rattle the cabin walls, wondering what kind of ghost she was expected to replace, and whether Thomas's silence was grief, resentment, or both. And so part 2 closes with Clara standing alone in the garden one cool evening, her hands deep in stubborn soil, the horizon awash in purple twilight, her back aching but her spirit unbroken. As behind her the cabin glowed faintly with lamplight, Jacob's laughter carrying faintly from inside while Thomas's low voice murmured something she could not catch, and Clara, dirt streaked across her face and sweat drying at her temples, lifted her eyes to the vast endless sky and whispered not to God this time, but to the land itself, fierce and unyielding, "I will not leave, do you hear me? You will not break me." And in that vow was the steel of a woman who had crossed a continent for a place in the world and who, come what may, refused to be sent back east in defeat. The weeks that followed were a blur of sweat, silence, and stubbornness, for Clara threw herself into the rhythm of ranch life with a determination that seemed to surprise even herself, rising before dawn to fetch water and light the fire, grinding beans into meals that tasted no better but at least filled the stomach, tending the garden though the soil fought her every inch, and though her hands blistered and her back screamed, she carried on. For each day that she survived felt like a stake driven deeper into the land that she swore would not reject her. Jacob, still suspicious, shadowed her steps with a sharp tongue and quick eyes, mocking her attempts at milking or chopping wood. But when she held her ground without flinching, when she turned his jeers into gentle jests, he began to falter. And one evening, when Clara stitched a rip in his trousers by lamplight, Jacob leaned against the table with a boy's awkward gratitude, muttering that his mother had sown better. But maybe Clara's work would hold just as long. And though the words were rough, Clara felt her heart swell, for it was the first time the boy had spoken of his mother in her presence without bitterness. Thomas, however, remained an enigma, speaking little. Working hard, his silence as heavy as stone, and though Clara longed to know the man behind the rough edges, he seemed to guard his grief like a locked chest, never offering a key. Yet there were moments, small and fleeting, when she caught him watching her with something other than cold appraisal, when she steadied a frightened cow with calm hands, when she laughed despite the dust in her hair, when she hummed a hymn over the garden rose, and in those moments she felt the faintest thaw of ice, though he never said a word. One Sunday, Thomas took them to church in town, a simple clapboard building where the hymnals were worn and the benches creaked, and Clara felt every eye on her as the preacher spoke of faith and endurance. Whispers chased her even there, women in bonnets judging the Boston girl with no family and no children. And yet when the final hymn swelled, Clara sang with a voice clear enough to still Jacob's fidgeting and make Thomas glance her way, as if startled by the strength of it, though he turned back quickly, jaw tight. Afterward, outside the church, a rancher's wife leaned close enough for Clara to hear her hiss. "You won't last, they never do." And though the words stung, Clara straightened her back and smiled so sweetly it silenced the woman more effectively than anger ever could. And on the wagon ride home, as the prairie rolled endless beneath the sky, Jacob asked her to sing the hymn again, his young voice hesitant but hopeful. And when she obliged, Thomas said nothing, but Clara thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, as if the music had reached a place in him long walled off. That night, lying on her straw mattress, Clara realized something had shifted, small, almost imperceptible, but real, and she clutched it like a flame in the dark, vowing again that she would not be driven out by gossip or silence. For this land, this family, this hard man and wary boy, they were hers to fight for, and she would not leave. Autumn came sudden to the Wyoming valley, the nights sharper, the mornings rhymed with frost, and Clara felt the season in her bones as much as in the thinning garden. For each task grew heavier with the knowledge that winter would soon test them harder than gossip or silence ever could. One late afternoon, a storm rolled out of the west, sky bruised purple and black, wind shrieking across the plains, and Thomas barked orders with the urgency of a man who knew storms could steal both stock and shelter in a heartbeat, sending Jacob to latch the barn while he and Clara dragged hay bales beneath cover, the wind tearing at her skirt and the cold rain soaking her hair until she could hardly see. Yet she matched his pace, refusing to let the storm or the man break her. And when a branch crashed down near the fence, startling the horses into panic, Clara didn't scream. She threw her weight against the gate to keep them penned, rain stinging her eyes, and Thomas, rushing to her side, met her gaze with a flash of something like respect before they wrestled the gate shut together. By the time the storm passed, the land was slick with mud, the cabin dripping at the eaves, and they collapsed by the fire, soaked to the skin, Jacob chattering with the thrill of survival while Clara wrung water from her hair, laughing despite herself, a sound so warm it seemed to soften the cabin itself, and Thomas, silent in the corner, allowed the faintest curve of a smile before turning back to stoke the fire. The storm left more than broken branches. It left sickness, for within days Jacob fell feverish, his skin hot as embers, his breath shallow, and Clara's heart clenched as she sat by his side through the night, sponging his brow, coaxing him to drink, singing hymns in a soft voice that trembled with exhaustion. Thomas paced the floor, helpless fury in his movements, until at last he muttered, "The doctor's 2 days' ride. He won't make it in time." And Clara, steady despite fear clawing her, answered, "Then will have to be enough." And with that she brewed willow bark tea, laid cool cloths, whispered prayers into the dark, and refused to leave Jacob's side even when her own body ached with weariness. For 3 nights the fever raged, and in those long hours Thomas's silence cracked, his voice rough as gravel as he confessed in fragments the story of his late wife, how she too had burned with fever, how no prayer or doctor could save her, how he had buried her under the cottonwood by the creek while Jacob stood silent and small, and how since that day he had built walls of stone around his heart, unwilling to lose or trust again. Clara, listening with tears in her eyes, laid her hand over his calloused one and whispered, "I'm not her, but I am here." And though he didn't answer, he didn't pull away either, which in that moment felt like a greater gift than words. On the 4th morning, Jacob's fever broke, sweat cooling his brow, his breathing deepening into true sleep, and Clara slumped forward in relief, tears streaking her cheeks, while Thomas stood in the doorway watching her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a stranger sent from Boston, not as a burden or reminder of grief, but as a woman who had fought beside him for what mattered most. Days later, when Jacob was strong enough to walk the yard again, Thomas came to Clara as she scrubbed laundry by the creek, his hat in his hands, his voice low and awkward, saying only, "You saved him," and she looked up, water dripping from her fingers, and answered simply, "We saved him," and for a heartbeat their eyes held, unspoken understanding passing between them like a fragile bridge across years of silence and hurt. But even as the bond grew, trouble brewed from beyond the homestead. For word of Clara's defiance, the Boston bride who worked like a ranch hand, who stood tall against gossip, spread through the valley, stirring both admiration and resentment. And one evening a neighbor rode up, a man with a crooked grin and 2 easy words, hinting that a woman like her might be better off with someone less cold than Thomas, his meaning clear as he lingered too long. And though Clara dismissed him with calm sharpness, Thomas's jaw tightened when she told him, and his silence that night burned heavier than any storm, until finally he muttered, "This place doesn't forgive weakness, Clara, it never will," and she, with fire in her chest, answered, "Then it's a good thing I'm not weak," before turning away, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the certainty that she had already bound herself to this land, this boy, this man, and no storm, no fever, no gossiping neighbor would drive her off. And so, as the first snow dusted the hills, Clara stood at the cabin door, Jacob at her side, Thomas behind her, and whispered once more to the land and to herself, "I will not leave," the vow now stronger than ever, rooted not only in defiance but in love quietly growing, like a flame shielded against the wind, waiting for the moment it would blaze. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy quilt stitched with silence and hardship, snow piling against the cabin walls, wind howling across the prairie with a voice that never tired, and in that endless white world, Clara discovered the truest test of her vow. For each day was a battle against cold and hunger, hauling wood until her shoulders ached, breaking ice on the water trough with numbed hands, mending worn clothes by the flicker of lamplight. And though her fingers cracked and her breath smoked in the air, she carried on without complaint because to give in even once was to admit defeat. Jacob, restless from being penned indoors, grew softer toward her with each passing week, helping split kindling, bringing her scraps of stories about the valley, even daring to laugh at her clumsy snow boots. And when one night she read aloud from a battered Bible until his eyes closed in sleep, Thomas lingered in the doorway longer than usual, his face unreadable but his presence heavy with meaning. In those long winter nights, silence stretched. But it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people bound by survival, by shared breath against the storm, and Clara began to sense that beneath Thomas's guarded exterior lay a man who noticed everything. How she tucked Jacob's quilt tighter, how she braved the cold to scatter grain for the hens, how she hummed softly while cooking beans yet again, making the plain meal taste less bitter. He said little, but once when she nearly slipped on ice carrying a pail, he caught her by the arm, his grip strong, steady. And when she laughed nervously at her own clumsiness, he didn't let go at once, only met her gaze with something unspoken before stepping back, leaving her heart pounding harder than the icy fall had threatened. The winter ground them down, yet it also bound them. And one evening, after a storm had trapped them inside for 3 days straight, Clara found herself at the table sewing while Jacob played with carved wooden animals, and Thomas sat sharpening a blade by the fire, the 3 of them enclosed in a circle of warmth while the wind raged outside. And she realized with sudden clarity that this was no longer a place she had been sent to. It was a place she was building, day by day, stitch by stitch, fire by fire, and the thought filled her with a fierce, quiet pride. Still, doubts lingered, carried on the lips of neighbors who came rarely but always with sharp eyes, whispering that Thomas would never open his heart again, that Clara was only filling shoes that could not be filled. And when those words reached her, she stood taller, meeting their glances with calm resolve, for she knew she was not a replacement but a woman carving her own place in this home. As February wore on and the snow began to soften, Clara stepped out one dawn to find the valley washed in pale light, the cottonwood by the creek heavy with frost and Thomas beside her, both of them silent as the world seemed to hold its breath. and in that stillness she felt his hand brush against hers, rough and tentative, not quite holding, not quite retreating, but enough to tell her that something long frozen was beginning to thaw, and though no words passed between them, Clara knew she was no longer simply surviving. She was becoming part of a family, and she would never ever let it be taken from her. Spring came late but certain, the snow shrinking into rivulets that fed the creek, the cottonwood stretching green fingers toward the sky, and Clara felt the land itself breathe again after months of holding its breath. Yet in her heart the season stirred more than relief. It carried a quiet sense of beginning, as if all the hardship behind them had been not just survival but preparation for something more. She worked the garden soil with steady hands, Jacob darting about with new energy, while Thomas mended fences, his figure strong against the horizon, and Clara found herself watching him not as the man who had once frightened her with silence, but as the man who had stood beside her in storm and sickness, who had caught her when she slipped, who had let his hand linger against hers on a frozen dawn, and though words were still rare between them, each shared glance seemed heavier, fuller, waiting only for the right moment to break open. That moment came one evening when the valley glowed with golden light, and the smell of fresh earth rose sweet in the air. Clara stood on the porch brushing dust from her skirts, when Thomas joined her, his hat in his hands, his voice rough as he began, "You came here with nothing but a name and a promise, and I gave you no kindness for it. But you stayed." And Clara, her breath catching, answered softly, "I stayed because this is where I belong." And for the first time his eyes met hers without the walls he had always carried, raw with both fear and longing. As he whispered, "Then let it be so, Clara. Let this be your home, if you'll have me as I am." And though her heart thundered, she stepped toward him without hesitation, laying her hand against his chest and saying, "I already do." And in that simple vow something in him broke free, the man of stone at last bending, his arms closing around her in an embrace that carried all the weight of grief, survival, and newfound hope. From that night forward the cabin was different. Not transformed overnight into laughter and ease, but warmed with a gentleness that had not lived there in years. Thomas's silence grew less heavy, Jacob's laughter more frequent, and Clara, though still burdened with the endless work of ranch life, found joy in each task, for it was no longer proof of her worth but an expression of the love she had built. Hand by hand, heart by heart, neighbors still whispered, as neighbors always do. But when a man came once more hinting at offers better than Thomas could give, Clara met him with such steady fire in her gaze that he rode off without another word, and Thomas, standing in the doorway behind her, said nothing but touched the brim of his hat in silent thanks. By summer the garden she had once wrestled from barren earth bloomed with beans, squash, and bright rows of flowers she had planted for no reason but beauty, and Jacob, now taller and steadier, ran between the rows with pride, calling them ours instead of paws. And Clara knew then that her vow not to leave had taken root deeper than she had ever imagined. It had become not only her promise, but their shared truth. On a warm evening, as fireflies blinked across the fields and the cottonwood whispered in the breeze, Clara sat with Thomas and Jacob on the porch, the three of them wrapped in the quiet peace of belonging, and she thought back to the day she had arrived, frightened, unwanted, half convinced she would be sent away, and she almost laughed at how far she had come. She reached for Thomas's hand, rough and steady, Jacob leaning against her shoulder, and in that stillness she whispered one last time, not to the land, not to herself, but aloud for them both to hear, "I will not leave." And Thomas, his voice low but certain, answered, "Neither will I," sealing not only her vow but his. And the homestead, once a place of sorrow and silence, became instead a place of family, of promise, of love hard-earned and unshakable as the mountains that framed their sky.